In our broader world at war, it is easy to forget about this one tiny axis, which often feels more like a Cold War relic than something to be taken seriously. But then you remember that it is the top target for a particular Trump administration official, plus it manages to pop up in the news every month or so. Indeed, not too long ago, we were discussing a Cuban tanker crisis. Today we move to something more serious, a Cuban Drone Dilemma. Yes, a report citing a U.S. intelligence official indicates that Russia and Iran have given more than 300 military drones to Cuba, with plans for further deliveries. The news raises the possibility that U.S. mainland targets could be under threat, and that, in turn, further underscores the possibility that the United States might make a second play in the Caribbean this year. But the real story here is far more complicated. So today, we will begin with a quick update on what has happened over the last couple of months in Cuba, because a lot has happened, but it has been buried under the bigger stories from Iran and Ukraine. Then I will describe what is in the report, and I'm going to pull no punches there, because the report omits critical information that is necessary to actually understand the real threat. Nonetheless, in the absence of better reporting on the subject, we will then discuss why Russia and Iran might pursue this strategy. The conversation there tends to drift towards scarce Patriot resources, but we will debunk that soon enough. Finally, we will conclude with a more general comment on the drone revolution. There is a perception that drones will empower weaker states, but that is a first-order effect that does not consider how opponents might respond to the potential threat, and those responses can make weaker states worse off than in a world where drones simply did not exist. But let's start with a quick rundown of what is brewing in Cuba. You will recall that after the United States successfully removed the former/still technically Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, the U.S. Navy imposed a quarantine on Cuba, preventing the island from specifically importing any oil. This is no joke. Cuba imports about 60 to 70% of its needs, leaving a massive shortfall. Gasoline became impossibly unaffordable for the majority of citizens there, and the country began experiencing rolling blackouts. In late March, Russia sent a single tanker to the island, leading to speculation of whether we would have a Cuban tanker crisis if the United States tried to intercept it. Trump backed down, however, ostensibly citing humanitarian needs, maybe involving some food, and thereby let the tanker offload some much-needed oil. This was, at most, a band-aid, though, giving Cuba no more than a couple of weeks of extra fuel. Almost 2 months have passed since then, without any further deliveries confirmed. Russia dispatched a second tanker to Cuba in early April, but it has spent the last month stalled in the middle of the Atlantic, suggesting that the Kremlin does not buy into Mexican food memes and does not want to try running the quarantine a second time. Meanwhile, the director of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, along with at least 3 officials with very blurry faces, visited Cuba a week ago. Obviously, the lingering threat is that the United States will try to run back the special Maduro operation, this time on a more proximate Caribbean target. Although I have never specifically asked the leadership in Cuba whether they would like that to happen, I do not believe that they would. And if you were in their position, you might start looking for ways to deter the United States from trying. With that, now we can get into the current report. The story broke on Sunday, with Axios citing a senior U.S. official, who was in turn leaking classified intelligence. Quote, Cuba has acquired more than 300 military drones, and recently began discussing plans to use them to attack the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay, U.S. military vessels, and possibly Key West. The island has been acquiring attack drones of varying capabilities from Russia and Iran since 2023, and within the past month, Cuban officials have sought more drones and more military equipment from Russia. Okay, very interesting stuff, and good for Axios for reporting on it. But a fundamental piece of information is missing here. Anyone reporting on national security issues should be aware of how critical the missing information is, and the US official leaking the information should also know the answers to the question if the official is for real. Yet the article is silent. In particular, I would want to know exactly what kind of drones Cuba has acquired. At this point, drone is an umbrella term that tells you little about its offensive capacity, only that no one is physically on board. Heck, some of them are just used for reconnaissance and have no offensive capacity whatsoever. Meantime, on one end of the lethal spectrum, a standard quadcopter is a drone. However, 300 quadcopters is a joke. I mean, I would literally laugh if anyone in the national security community was taking this seriously. In training, a drone pilot typically wrecks 5 to 10 drones per day. Lest we forget that I know this firsthand. If you were incredibly optimistic, thought 10 days of training would be sufficient, and wanted to have 100 drones left over to use in combat, that would get you 4 pilots. And at the end of the day, all you can do with them is put some tiny holes in facilities in Guantanamo Bay. Maybe if you were incredibly lucky and US service personnel were casually strolling around on the base of the day of the attack, you might inflict a few casualties. But like I said, this is a joke. The report indicates that Key West, Florida would be a potential target, which is about 160 kilometers away from Cuba. It is hard to find a common Russian drone with roughly the same range. The Zala Z-54 is the best match, if we trust speculated specs. It has a payload capacity of 15 to 25 kilograms, and 200 kilometers as maximum range. That would imply a target radius that looks like this. But bear in mind that Key West has a population of only about 27,000 people, and a typical Shahed drone has a payload of 50 kilograms. So color me concerned, but not particularly afraid. What would be far more interesting is if we were talking about actual Shahed drones. Using the default range for Shaheds, the new attack radius looks roughly like this. All of Florida is inside, plus Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans, Louisiana is right on the fringe. Shaheds would therefore be a much more serious threat. Extend that out to a maximum range Shahed, and now almost all of the eastern seaboard is in play. But more critically, and at much less of a stretch, the Gulf Coast along with all of its oil infrastructure could be hit. I point this out because simply smashing a Shahed into a building is destructive, but it is not that destructive. In contrast, Ukraine knows something about what happens if you have a long-range drone hit a target with its own fuel supply. Nonetheless, to put the quantity in context, Russia now fires about 300 Shaheds or Shahed decoys per day on average. So the worst-case Cuban scenario thus far is perhaps scary to Americans accustomed to the privilege of being defended by 2 giant oceans, but it is peanuts compared to the threat that Ukraine faces. With that in mind, let's shift to what is in it for Russia. Well, color me skeptical that Russia is actually doing much here. 300 drones over the course of around 3 years, minus some donations from Iran, would indicate that the Kremlin is not exactly being generous. I would speculate that Russia was mostly shipping the bottom of the barrel of excess supply to Cuba, outdated models that Ukraine has already developed defensive measures to counteract. I find it hard to imagine that anyone in the Kremlin believe that passing top-quality materiel to Havana would be a good idea. Now, the typical refrain that I have seen online about why Russia is doing this is because the Kremlin wants to keep US defenses occupied domestically. That would mean fewer donations to Ukraine, or sales to Ukraine through NATO countries, which is what Russia really cares about. It would also mean fewer transfers to Iran's regional opponents, which is also what that country really cares about. Typically, this conversation turns to Patriots, which is the key system that both Ukraine and the Gulf allies rely on to shoot down ballistic missiles. Unfortunately, the line of logic here is playing into the persistent false perception that Patriots are a primary means of drone defense. They never were. They have been used on an emergency basis in the Gulf region for that purpose. Ukraine has used them as well to protect high-value targets. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. Shaheds are slow. It would take 2 hours for them to reach Miami from Cuba, giving alert fighters stationed near Florida's southern point plenty of time to scramble and intercept them. The idea of hitting Texas's Gulf Coast oil infrastructure is also silly. That could take 10 hours of Shahed flight time. If the US Air Force can do nothing but sit there and watch refineries be set ablaze, the US government might as well just close up shop then and there. Patriots aside, the possibility of a drone attack on US soil does force the military to keep assets stateside. That will have minor effects on US deployments elsewhere, but I suppose that it is something. In reality, at least for Russia, the goal here is to do the bare minimum to try propping up an ally in the region. If Cuba could destroy substantial US infrastructure in response to another special Maduro operation, then Washington would opt against the strategy. That is something that Russia would like, and so maybe it is worth the investment. Finally, let's discuss the notion that the drone revolution benefits smaller countries. Yes, on the surface, drones give smaller countries options that they did not have before. And yes, the deterrence function that I described a second ago would be helpful. It turns out that autocratic leaders would prefer it if the United States could not snap its fingers and remove them from power. If this were merely a question of weaker countries building Shahed-style drones and doing with them what they will, then the benefit would be unambiguous. The problem is that one does not simply build drones without upsetting status quo powers, and that encourages preventive action, costly war, and inefficient outcomes for everyone, at least under some circumstances. Now, on the same day that the Cuba story broke, I published a lecture on my secondary channel on arms control, as a part of the Introduction to International Relations playlist that I have over there. I do not want to rehash everything here, but the basic lesson from that lecture is now relevant. In short, building weapons creates inefficiencies just like a war does, and so bargained resolutions, in principle, should leave both parties better off. Essentially, opponents need to treat potential arms proliferators as though the weapons have already been built. By doing so, the potential arms proliferator has no reason to actually construct the weapons. The benefit for the opponent is that the proposal can be slightly hedged down to exploit how the proliferator did not actually pay any costs. One of the ways that negotiated resolutions can break down is if the opponent cannot observe the decision to arm. If preventive war is credible, it may be cheaper to deal with a problem militarily than buy out the arms proliferator's incentive to launch a weapons program. Worse, the threat of preventive war cannot dissuade the arms proliferator from trying to build covertly. That, in turn, encourages the opponent to initiate preventive wars, even without knowing that there is a weapons program to destroy. As a result, the whole thing ends in a disaster. The Cuban Drone Dilemma is particularly concerning because of how easy it is for the weapons to secretly reach their destination. They are small, and so the only real way to stop Cuba from acquiring them is to fully quarantine the island, inspect every vessel heading to a Cuban port, and detain anyone violating the rule. This is not a preventive war in a kinetic sense, but it is still a very costly measure for every party involved. And there is always the concern that the United States may find regime change the cheaper long-term solution to the problem. However, I would describe this as a future concern, not a present one. The 300 drones that have been sent to Cuba likely are nothing serious. And unless there is intelligence that much larger quantities of drones are headed the island's way, and those drones are closer to top-of-the-line models, then the threat to the United States is minimal. Furthermore, it is hard to see how Russia or Iran would be able to provide such aid given their current situations. Thus, I am filing this one for later from a strategic perspective. However, maybe I should keep it fresh in mind for US political purposes. There is plenty of speculation that this was an authorized leak from the Trump administration. Basically, the White House wants to gather public support for regime change, and this is part of shaping the narrative. I don't know. Maybe that is true. But I will say this. I just spent 5 minutes explaining why the report offers scant details to indicate that this is a serious threat to the US homeland. It is not what I would leak if I actually wanted to gather support to invade Cuba. I would either divulge more serious information about Shaheds, Or, if the shipments were a bunch of quadcopters, I would not bother leaking anything. Take that for what you will. Speaking of takes, what are our takeaway lines for today? Cuba is politically and economically on the edge once again. Some Russian and Iranian drones have reached Cuba, but nothing has been disclosed to suggest that they are a serious threat to the United States. Russia and Iran may be trying this to keep U.S. defenses closer to the homeland, though that strategy is not as effective as it might seem. And there are serious preventive war concerns here to keep in mind for later. Meanwhile, if you want to learn more about that arms control scenario, check out that aforementioned lecture. It is much more complicated than I just described here, as it can result in cases of both mistaken preventive war and successful power shifts. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.